Should I tell the Illmatic story or?
Tell the Illmatic story, yeah.
Good segue.
Okay,
You set yourself up.
thank you. I don't want it to be boring. Hey, I'm trying to keep it interesting.
Oh,
here.
this is nerd paradise right now. You don't even know. Like the listenership of this show are a billion of us.
Okay, so what happened was we had halftime and live at the barbecue. Okay, Nas's first two appearances. Live at the barbecue, everyone knows the main source. I should mention also, because you brought up something about the ratings, and I think it's important to note that
those 4.5 mics.
The ratings were the number one thing that people spoke. There was two things that people cared about: who's on the cover and what rating did they get. Those are the things that we heard the most feedback on. That was what every just general person on the street cared about. The other thing they cared about is like seeing what the rappers were like in real life, like, like what cars they drive and things like that. So there was layers to it, but basically, so we actually gave, if I take one more step back, there was a brief period of time when we were reviewing singles as well as albums, giving ratings to singles. We always reviewed singles, but for a short period of time, we actually gave the mic ratings to singles. Looking out the front door, got 5 mics, as it should. It's a hip hop classic, no doubt, right? I love Large Professor. I love Main Source. I think a lot of us love that record. That was the only time in the history of the Source that anyone ever thanked us for a review. We did hundreds and hundreds of reviews. One time only, the Sir Scratch and K-Cut's mother showed up at the Source office. They were Canadian, remember? They're from Toronto. I think they're from Toronto.
Canadians.
They're so polite, right? Those Canadians, right?
Know,
they're so nice.
Yeah. Hey.
They're so nice. And they showed, and this was literally all we ever got was negative feedback from people that were mad.
Right.
One time I can ever recall, somebody was like, "Thank you so much. That review meant so much to us. And she gave me a bottle of like Canadian whiskey or something. And I kept it like on my desk for years. But that was the only time that anyone ever thanked us for a review. The feedback was only either nothing, silence, or negative. The only positive feedback we ever got was from Main Source's Sir Scratch and K-Cut. They were brothers. Their mother.
Wow.
Yeah.
Shout out to Manners.
That's right. That's right.
Totally.
Being polite goes a long way. No, I appreciated it that she did that. It was very nice of her. But
before you tell the story, and I'm glad you mentioned Main Source, let me ask your opinion. It was actually that Main Source issue that was my not North Star, but I believed that getting a 4.5, getting 4.5 mics in the Source was better than getting 5 mics in the Source.
Why?
Because I mean, this is, everyone has their whole golden era thing. You say yours is 84 to 94. The period in which we would have critical thinking Friday discussions of an album, like religiously, like, and I miss that so much about hip hop now. It's definitely between like 88 and kind of 90, maybe we stopped in 96, 97. Because then it became like, well, they said this was classic, and we don't think this is classic. Like, we became like Waldorf and Statler in the Muppets. Like,
yeah, exactly. Thumbs down. Yeah.
Right. But I will say that for me, I was like, okay, when something gets 5 mics, because someone in my crew didn't get why De La Soul is Dead got a perfect 5. And I was like, dog, this is the best sequence records, the samples I never heard before, the rhyme stuff, like everything about this album is pitch perfect. And they were like, yeah, but and he said, I'm a little biased because they, in his mind, it was like, they're just always giving out 5s. And I'm like, no, it's quite the opposite. Like, I think the Source is really hard to please. And this is an example of it. But that stuck with me. And I realized that people don't criticize you as much if you have a 4.5. It's almost like 4.5 is the same effect as a 5, but it doesn't make you that threatening where you got to be like, man, fuck, da 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 da. Or I don't know. That's my theory. I always thought 4.5 was better than a 5, and so
there was a lot of the way the reviews, the way the ratings worked as we got more mature. Now, if we're moving into like the early '90s, is that Reggie became the music editor, as I mentioned, and we would assign out the reviews to people. Sometimes I would write a couple, but for the most part, that was kind of, the reviews were kind of a place for the newer writers for the most part. You know, it was kind of like a way for someone to break into the source.
really,
Yeah. No,
you
yeah.
would trust you would
Well,
trust a
I mean,
newbie to that instead of like
for like a Spice
well-tested-
One album or something. I mean, you know, for like a, you know, for a, not for like the big marquee names, but for
Right.
like, you know, for like a new artist, you know, like somebody new, we would give it to like somebody new because that was a chance for them to kind of prove themselves, you know. But the rating, okay, so there was like a separate thing. The review would get written, but we would have a separate meeting every month with all the main people there, the people I mentioned, and we would discuss the ratings. And that was when
would you thoroughly review it? Like thoroughly listen to it, or just like
you would defer to the person kind of who had, you know, if I hadn't personally listened to the whole album, I would try to be, you know, cognizant of that and not just give opinions on what I knew, you know, like, but there were only a handful of times that I like forced the issue and like put my foot down and like, we got to give this a 5. Illmatic was one of those only times.
Okay, so yeah, all right. So Illmatic, you thought it was classic material. Who was like, it might be a 4, or
Reggie was like, you know, it's not. We don't know if it's going to be a class. I mean, it was easy to say. Listen, 5 was called a hip hop classic, so it was easy to say in the course of this meeting, which we had every month, where we would discuss the ratings. Is that really a hip hop classic? Is this going to be remembered 20 years from now as like a very important? And it was a hard question. You know, you're like, here we are ahead of even it coming out. We're like months ahead of we're like among like maybe a dozen people that have even heard this record. And now we have to decide, is it going to be a hip hop classic? It's kind of hard, you know, it's like, it's not easy. In the case of Illmatic, okay, so what happened was we had heard Halftime. We loved it. That movie Zebrahead, remember? I think that came up on another one of your episodes I saw.
Yeah, with Clark Kent.
Right, that's correct. Right, with Clark Kent.
I worked at Rough House, and we had the premiere of Zebrahead, and Clark Kent starts spitting In Vogue's Hold On, and Nas gets up and freestyle, and I think maybe I was like the 6th in line. So that's my.
Oh, that's right. You were that's when you rapped. I remember. Yes, that's right. Okay. Okay, cool. So we loved Halftime and Live at the Barbecue. This kid Nas, incredible. You know, he was shocking. You know, I'm waving automatic guns and nuns, and you know, hell for snuffing Jesus, and all that stuff. So it was shocking. It was like shocking rap, but it was obviously really good, and he was really literate, and it sounded great, and we were very, very hungry to hear more from this kid Nas. So I had a trip booked to Philly, and on the agenda was to visit Chris Schwartz and to go to Rough House Records. So it was late 90. It was after Zebrahead. It was probably late 92. I go to Philly, and I sat in that Rough House when Rough House was in the suburbs. It was like he had this office it was no longer in the city. It was in the suburbs somewhere, I remember. And Chris Schwartz was at the desk, and, you know, we talked about a few different things. And then, you know, Rough House had some great records. You know, they had some great stuff. So, but my real agenda for being there was I wanted to hear more Nas. I didn't tell him that, but that was my true agenda for going there. So I go there, and Chris Schwartz, as you recall, had kind of like the air of like a messy person, sort of like his hair was kind of messy.
Uncut Gems, the original version.
Yeah, exactly. It was a very hectic, noisy, just sort of like disheveled atmosphere, right? And so there was like a desk with like coffee cups and piles of tapes and records and all that. And so I go in and I'm like, hey man, so we talked about other stuff. And then I'm like, so listen about this guy, Nas, he's like, Nas, you know who that is? And I was like, yeah, of course we know who that is. Halftime, Live at the Barbecue. He's like, oh man, I mean, I'm surprised you guys know about him. And I'm like, oh, we love him. We love Nas. We're really curious to hear more stuff. And he searches through his desk, moves some stuff around. He picks up a cassette and he hands it to me. He said, you can check this out. I was like, I can keep it? He's like, yeah, you can keep it. Put it in my pocket. I leave the meeting. I go back to 30th Street Station. I get back on the train, the Amtrak back to New York City. I take out my Walkman. Still using Walkman back then. Pop in the Walkman, hit play. And what I have in my hands, in my Walkman, is the entire Illmatic album, like 6-7 months before it came out. Okay. It was like so long in advance. It was the first draft of it. There was like multiple mixes were different. I still have this cassette, by the way. It's sitting in my office right now. Yeah. Wow. I have it here right now. So basically, I'm sitting here on this Amtrak train listening to Represent, One Love, all these like unbelievable songs. And by the time I get to New York, I am like floating in the air with the realization that I have like the holy grail in my pocket. I have maybe like the greatest album I've ever heard in my life, like sitting and it's like this feeling of,
and no one
knows about it. No one's heard it. It was like literally like, I don't know why. To this day, I have no idea why Chris Schwartz, I mean, obviously he wants to promote his music, but it was way too early to give that cassette to the Source. It was
they didn't know what they had, which is why I went back to Columbia and not on, because we had Nas on Rough House for the longest. And then suddenly it was like, shrug. Columbia took him back.
That's right. And Faith Newman and so forth. Right. And so that's what happened. I think he just didn't realize that he had this, legendary, groundbreaking, earth-shattering record here. So I get back to New York. I immediately, it's like 10, 11 o'clock at night. I go back to the Source office downtown. I knew that some people were going to be there. I walk in, it's Matty C, Reef, Chris Wilder, Scott Free, later on Loud Records A&R was there, I remember. And I walk in and we had like a mediocre, system, some kind of like off the shelf stereo system. I hit play and I play the entire album for this assembled heads, the Mind Squad. And literally every single person is just like, I remember Scott Free was literally laying on the floor. Like he was so blown away. Like when people like fall down out of like mock, shock, like he was just, the entire room was just, this is insane. This is so good. Especially.
Can I ask something though?
Yeah.
Because the thing was, when I had those moments, they were chaotic bomb squad moments.
Yeah.
I never had that moment with a regular meat and potatoes, perfect beat,
like a boom
perfect
bap
loop,
type.
perfect rhyme. Just nothing. There's nothing. There's no novelty to it. It's not like, oh yeah, it was a classic because they're using childhood records or they're using 95 trillion samples. Like I'd never heard just a perfect beat, rhyme, perfection record. And so it took me, because it didn't come with bells and whistles, the same bells and whistles that 3 Feet High and Rising was, or Nation of Millions was, or America's Most Wanted was. He wasn't hyper gangster. He was like, for me, it was like such a risk. Because when I heard it again, it was that Gangstar issue. I read the review first, and then I was like, I got it. And I was like, well, it's so normal. It's only 10 songs. Like rap records back then were like 27 songs. I was like, there's no skits. There's no. And my manager finally brought me down to earth. He's like, yo, man, this is what Intervisions, but Stevie Wonder was. Like, it was just 9 perfect songs. Like, this is 9 perfect songs. And I actually had to grapple with that. Like, I wasn't in touch with how I felt. I still had to follow what you guys said And I had so many questions about a non-bells and whistles record getting that much acclaim to it. But you guys instantly felt you got goosebumps from the gate.
He knew.
Yeah. I mean, I remember I loved every song. I liked every single song, especially One Love. That was the one that pushed me over the top. Like, it's just so deep, it just sounds so, and his lyrics are so good on it. It's just, so that was like something like, 6 or 8 months before the album ended up coming out. So we have this holy grail now sitting in our possession. What do we do with it? And I think you're right. It was that issue with Gangstar on the cover.
Yep.
And I went and I took on the job of, because I had this experience, I went and took on the job of writing the feature about Nas, introducing Nas to the world. It was called The Second Coming. Mm-hmm. And it was a reference to obviously Rakim, because that was, the God MC. That's who everyone viewed as pretty much the greatest rapper of all time, almost universally. And Nas was viewed as, the next in line for that kind of a title. Just by us. I mean, I don't know. The world didn't know yet, but that was how we were looking at it. And we went, and then Matty C went and interviewed all the producers that were involved, Pete Rock, Premier, Q-Tip, and Large Professor. And so it was like this dream team. So we put together the story, and then we still had to do the review part of it. So we assigned it in one of these cases, again,
to Minya.
To a newer writer, and her name was Minya Oh.
Yeah.
Later known to the world as Miss Info.
Miss Info, right.
Yes.
But she called herself Shortie?
She called herself Shortie, right, because she was an incredibly hip, uptown New York chick, who came in and was just new shit, way ahead. I mean, but this was still very early in her evolution, I think, and we assigned her the job. I'm really glad it was her because,
But I was going to say, was it risky for you to not see this through? Like, were you not allowed to touch your own reviews, or would that have been seen as a conflict of interest? Like, well, you can't be the editor-in-chief and.
No, that wasn't really. I mean, like in this case, I think the reasoning was that I had already written. Like, I was obviously the main champion of it inside the building, but
you saw the story. You saw the story, the feature story, more important than his album review.
In my mind, that's more journalistic to me. Is like this feature story is where you tell the whole story, and like that's where. So
no
in
offense,
my mind,
I don't remember that story, but I remember that album review.
I get it. Yeah, that's okay. I understand. That's the case because listen, as I said earlier, what most people did, just like yourself, is they looked and see, who's on the cover? Okay, it's so-and-so. And then they'd flip right to the back and say, what rating did everything get? Like that was the normal way people consume the source. Absolutely, I get it.
Why didn't you put the record reviews in the front of the magazine then?
You know what? Again, I think it was earlier. Like I said, I was following that Rolling Stones structure, and they had the reviews in the back. So
by the way, I did read everything, but yes, I did read the thing backwards. So
I know, I get it. It's all good. So basically she did the review, but then again, this is where we had the big meeting, and I was pounding. This is one case where I used my authority to force the issue. And I was like, Reggie, it's a 5, man.
What did he want?
5. I think he wanted either a 4 or maybe a 4.5. The others in the room, everyone agreed with. I mean, the majority of people agreed with me. There was a few, maybe, I don't remember exactly who didn't. I know Reggie was the main voice of the opposition, and he lost. In this case, he lost the debate, and it got a 5. And I think he would admit that we were correct about giving it a 5. I mean, obviously, it's pretty much the iconic hip hop album, or among the iconic, legendary, all-time classic hip hop albums. I think everyone agrees with that.